All right. The hour of 4:30 having arrived, we will call to order the Finance Committee meeting of Monday, April 6th, 2020, and staff will call the roll. And I will unmute you all.
Alder Vidar.
Present.
Alder Vidar is here. Alder Furman.
Present.
Alder Furman is here. Alder Kimball.
Here.
Alder Kimball's here. Alder Harrington McKinney.
Here.
Alder Harrington McKinney is here. Alder Moreland.
Here.
Alder Moreland is here. Alder Verveer.
Here.
Alder Verveer is here. Mayor Rhodes Conway.
Present.
Mayor, you have quorum.
Thank you. I will mute you all again. And tech facilitator, do you want to read instructions?
Yes, I will go ahead and do that. Welcome to our virtual Finance Committee meeting. We are going to cover a few basic items before we start. To the members of the committee and city staff, the chair, clerk, and technical facilitator are responsible for muting and unmuting committee members. Please be mindful that during roll call, which we just had, all panelists will be unmuted until completed, at which time the chair will place panelists back on mute. Voting will be considered unanimous. However, if you object to unanimous vote, please use the raise hand feature when the chair asks for objections. After clicking participants at the bottom of your screen, you can find the raise hand feature at the bottom of your participants list. Also use the raise hand feature when you'd like to be recognized to speak or ask questions. This includes staff who are being asked a question. The chair will do their best to call on committee members in the order in which hands are raised. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Please wait for the chair to unmute you before speaking. If you lose connection at any point during the meeting, you can reconnect by clicking the link or calling the number in your original email. If you are watching a live stream, please mute the live stream now. There's a 30 to 40 second delay and the audio will cause feedback when you are unmuted, excuse me. Members of the public who have registered to speak, when your name is called, the facilitator will find your name based on the name you provided in your registration and permit you to speak. Please wait until you are unmuted to begin talking. The clerk will tell you when your time is up. If you need to share documentation with the council, please send it via email to allalders@cityofmadison.com. Unless there are questions of you from the committee, you will be unable to speak for the remainder of the meeting. In order to keep watching the meeting with the best quality we can, if you do not wish to speak, we encourage you to watch the meeting streamed at City of Madison /city channel or at YouTube/user/City of Madison, or find us on Charter Digital channel 994 and AT&T Uverse 99. Mayor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. All right, so this time we'll see if there are any disclosures or recusals. Please raise your hand if you have a disclosure or recusal for today's agenda. All right, seeing none, then we'll move on to the consent agenda. We already have requests for items 4 and 5 to be excluded from the consent agenda. Please raise your hand if there's anything else that you would like removed from the consent agenda. Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a question for staff on item number 2, please.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Furman.
Thank you, Mayor. I assume all number 6 will be removed. Is there going to be a staff presentation on that?
Yes, thank you, Alder.
Thank you.
Are there any other items to exclude from the consent agenda? All right, so at this point in time, the exclusions from the consent agenda are items 2, 4, 5, and 6. Alder Vidar, a motion?
Move adoption of the consent agenda.
Alder Harrington McKinney.
Second.
So the consent agenda is moved and seconded. Is there any objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor of the consent agenda? Seeing no objection, it will be recorded and the consent agenda is passed. So that will bring us to item number 2. Alder Badar.
Move adoption.
Alder Harrington McKinney.
Second.
Thank you. Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor. And I see that both Lynette and Jim are on our call here, so thank you both for being with us. My quick question is, I'm not used to seeing great news about increased popularity of these two programs. And Lynette, in your helpful memo to us, you state that I think the main rationale for why Home by the American Dream is experiencing increased popularity due largely to the doubling of the loan amount in 2018. But for the other program, the deferred loan payment, you just use the phrase consistent with the resolution that there are varying factors that have caused the program to experience a significant increase in popularity. I'm hoping that you could share with us some of the reasons why you think both of these programs, I guess, have seen increased popularity.
Sure.
Which is a good problem to have.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, Lynette, thanks.
Yeah. So in 2018, we actually increased the amount available for both of the loan programs. So the rehab program went up from about 15,000 per unit to the 25,000 per unit. So that was something that people could, apply for those funds and do a broader amount of work on their houses. We also aggressively started marketing the program. So getting into kind of the local newspapers, making sure we were translating the program materials and putting it into a variety of different kind of media. And then utilizing the NRTs. So our staff were promoting the programs, both of these programs, through some of the NRT networks as well.
Great, thank you very much for that explanation. Again, I think this is a good problem to have, except of course for the reduced support from the state. Do you anticipate, one last question, Lynette, do you anticipate that we will continue to experience less funding from the state for the by the American Dream program?
Yeah, so I don't know. When they had excess funds a couple years ago, and what they had told us when we applied during kind of an off-peak application process was Dane County, the city of Madison, was one of the most kind of proactive municipalities that use those funds. So I think if we have other municipalities throughout the state that have kind of are not using those Hickory funds, I think the state will continue to support our increased ask that we will continue kind of putting into our applications each year.
Very good. Thanks again, and congratulations on the relatively newfound popularity.
Thank you,
Mayor.
Alder. Are there any other questions for staff on this item? All right, I see no additional questions for staff. It has been moved and seconded. Is there discussion on this item? All right, seeing no discussion, is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of this item? Alder Harrington McKinney?
Thank you. I'm having problems raising my hand. I did have a question for staff. I'm sorry. I couldn't get in before the vote went forward.
Quite all right. Go ahead, Alder.
My question, Lynette, is that you mentioned that the marketing, and so and your program marketing through NRTs. Could you say more about that and expand what that looks like?
Yep. So mostly, especially with the NRTs, looking at connecting with banks. So especially with the down payment assistance program, the funding for that program is kind of ran where someone still has to qualify for a first mortgage. So I'm going to use the Balsam Russet area NRT as an example. We've made relationships for the Old National Bank that is in that area, working with the mortgage loan officer to start doing homebuyer education classes that they plan on rolling out once we can do homebuyer education classes again through the neighborhood center. They already did a test run where they did the homebuyer education to the neighborhood center staff. So staff would be aware of how that class would run in case people came in outside of the class asking the center questions. So that's kind of one of the ways where we're trying to build relationships in those areas, because it's really important, not just that residents understand that these programs are available. We need to get the lenders comfortable with using the programs and being able to explain the programs to people when they walk into that bank. And we need to get individuals comfortable with banking in general. So that's just kind of one way that we're working on kind of that, a new way of what I say marketing, of just not creating a brochure or a pamphlet. It's about creating some relationships in the community.
Okay, my second question, thank you so very much. My second question is that I understand your about informing and educating the lending institutions, but when you're sitting in the NRTs, how are you informing the people who are around the table, actually connecting with individuals who might qualify? What is that educational piece so that we are understanding and sharing it as well? Because in the NRT meetings, there are a lot of people around the table, but how is that education getting around the table?
Yeah. So I think, right now, we try to make sure our staff are knowledgeable. I think what I'm hearing you say is what we should be doing is kind of working with Tarek to make sure it's a point that we are, at least for every NRT, there's an agenda item.
Yes.
Once a year that we're reminding city staff about these programs. And we can do that.
Absolutely. And then sharing that out, because it's not only just the NRTs and our staff, that there are like 20 people around that table, and then having that information to refer them back to the staff is very important. So I'd like to see that expanded. That piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. All right, so any further questions or discussion? If not, is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of this item? Seeing no objection, we'll record a unanimous vote in favor of this item, and we will move on to item number 4. Alder Badar.
Move adoption.
Alder Harrington McKinney.
Second.
Thank you, Alders. Alder Campbell.
Yeah, I had 4 or 5 questions about this. I don't know if you'd like me to just ask them in quick succession or ask one and wait for the answer. How should we proceed?
Are your questions for Mr. Schmidtke?
Mr. Schmidtke and you.
All right, as you wish, Alder.
Okay, so I'm wondering, first of all, how you came up with the numbers of $50,000 and $250,000 operating in capital, and if you had something specific in mind when you came up with those numbers.
Mayor, I can jump in on that if you'd like.
Go ahead.
On the 50,000, I think that's a level of transfer that allows us to move pretty quickly to respond to any issues within agency budgets or between agency budgets. The threshold for budget transfers is established each year in the budget resolution. The $5,000 number was last changed in 1988, so it's over 30 years old. And so I think in normal times we can work through those issues and put budget amendments in front of the council. But I think in these times we felt that 50,000 was in the operating budget, reflected a number, particularly within professional or service contracts and supplies, that would allow us to move quickly, but not a number that was overly large. On the capital side, the average size of the capital projects in the 2020 budget is about 750,000. These are often large movements that have to occur either between projects or within projects. And so we felt that number again was sized to reflect those, how those budgets change over time, or what we might have to react to between specific projects or between programs that might have multiple projects within them. So that was our thinking on those numbers. Laura can jump in on this as well if she has additional perspectives from the budget transfer issue.
And Alder, my answer to that is this was recommended by staff. I didn't pick the numbers, they did, and I don't have anything particular in mind. Laura, did you want to add anything?
I don't have anything to add.
Alder?
Yes, so have any transfers taken place in the 2 weeks since this order has been in place?
Laura? No.
Any proposals for any transfers come through the EOC or come to anyone's attention? Anything in the works?
Laura?
We have had one request from the Economic Development Division, who is looking at trying to find the best way to get dollars out to local small businesses that are impacted. So in particular, they're looking at how they can utilize Kiva funding and then funding in the cooperative development funding within the capital budget. There's also been staff that have been looking at ways to utilize food funding that lives in different appropriations right now.
And that would require a transfer from other departments, those two things?
Though in both cases, those would require council authorized approvals just in terms of the categories where appropriations would be moving across.
So under this item, they would not need council approval?
Those are just items that people have brought forth. I haven't seen the dollar amounts to know whether or not this particular item if it would be impacted by this resolution being adopted.
Okay. So I'm also wondering why it's being a blanket authority until the end of the year is being requested, when instead of bringing individual items to finance and council as they come up. If there's been nothing in the last 2 weeks that has really no request to move money, why aren't we just doing it the normal way? Why do we need this?
I think we just felt that we're going to be in this situation through the year and have to respond to conditions we perhaps can't even imagine right now, and that the budget resolution is, as I said, approved by the council every year. So this can only be in place through the end of the year, and when the council adopts the budget for 2021, that again would have whatever is, whatever you decide as a council through that resolution would have those budget transfer thresholds back in place.
The other thing that I would just add is that because we are so early in the fiscal year, departments have been able to deal with unforeseen expenses without hitting their budget stops because they have a full year of appropriation. And so as the response continues through the fiscal year, we're going to be faced with more and more situations where people will hit up against their budget stop that, you know, we won't have a solution to, we would just have less flexibility in terms of trying to deal with major unforeseen things as we move through the fiscal year.
So I'm still trying to understand why we couldn't take these unforeseen things up as they come along and work them through either our regular process, which is by introduction and referral to finance and then back to council, or by taking them up under suspension of the rules at council.
Again, that's just, that's a few, you just described steps in the process that take time, and you can certainly decide to do that. We put this forward as a tool given the unique and unprecedented situation we're facing right now. And as Laura said, as we move through the year, our flexibility diminishes as we spend more of the authorized appropriations. And that may force us to move even faster to try to address specific costs that might come up, contracts we have to enter into rapidly, and have dollars available to pay for them. So that was the thinking in putting the proposal forward. And then obviously it's for the mayor and the council to decide how to proceed on that. But that was our thinking in putting those dollar amounts forward in those amounts. And I think just given that the $5,000 level is, I think, relatively small in the size of the budget that we're now dealing with compared to 30 years ago. And then added to that is the unprecedented nature of this current situation we're in.
So, okay, I'm getting to the end of my list. Thank you for those answers. There's nothing in this resolution that talks about reporting any of these transfers to council. And I know those typically under our regular budget resolution with the current limits, those aren't reported. But did you contemplate reporting these things out or not? And because I don't see anything like that in the resolution.
No, we did not include a reporting mechanism. Again, that's certainly something you can consider, and we can certainly do that. And all that information is readily available, and we can make it available to you if that's the approach you'd like to take. But no, we did not contemplate a reporting mechanism.
Okay, thanks. I'm done, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Harrington McKinney, question?
Yes, I think that those were answered. Mine was basically this to help with fluidity based upon the COVID-19. But the other piece is that Laura said something about response to the budget stops. Would you say more about that and clarify that? Two things. And when you said budget stops, what was that? Expand on that. And then in terms of fluidity and being able to respond, what's about the regular process? If this went through the regular process, what are we looking at? Is that 1 month, 30 days, or do you have any projection to add to that?
So under the resolution that the council adopts every year when the budget is finalized, staff are able to approve amendments to the budget under $5,000. So if somebody's moving funding in the budget across a major category in an increment less than $5,000, that is handled and approved administratively. If a department is looking to move funding across major categories of spending in excess of $5,000, that requires a council amendment and must be adopted with a 15-vote majority. Typically, as Alder Kimball mentioned, the protocols for amendments to the budget are introduced to the council, referred to the finance committee, and back to the common council for approval. So in terms of a turnaround period, if we were in a time of year where council meetings are happening every other week, that approval process would be 3 weeks. But if we're going into a period like the month of April, where there's a gap in council meetings, the turnaround time could be more like 4 to 5 weeks, depending upon the timing of the council and the finance committee meetings.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Are there other questions for staff? Alder Moreland.
Yes, I just wanted to go back to what Rebecca brought up. Is there, I mean, what would be the process for us to ask for some type of reporting on what's being moved? Anything that's at that threshold that we're about to vote on now? What would we need to do?
Alder, you would need to amend the resolution.
Okay. How specific does that need to be, that amendment?
I think, Alder, it would be up to you, but it could be as general as, and reports will be made to the finance committee, or it could be as specific as how often you want those reports to come to this body, or if you want them to go to a different body.
Okay. Is this the appropriate time to make that amendment?
Once we get through questions,
okay,
would be the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor. Some of my questions were already asked and answered. I do want to ask a follow-up question that was asked by Alderperson Kimball of perhaps Your Honor, because I think staff responded previously, but Mayor, would you be supportive of a possible further amendment that would limit this authority to perhaps the next several months, perhaps consistent with our action last Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning at the last council meeting relating to the emergency authority, that this budget authority only be available till June 2nd, and then perhaps amended further if we need to?
Alder, I would be amenable to that, and also to a reporting requirement. But I just would caution that the economic impacts of this are going to be felt more in the later months of the year than now. And so the need for this will grow, as staff mentioned. And that depending on which model you believe, our peak here may be reached this month, but it may not come until June. And so if we are peaking in terms of number of cases in June, we're still going to be very much in the thick of it. So I don't object, and certainly we can revisit the question if we need to, but I think those things should be taken into consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Any other questions? Alder Rummel.
Hi, everybody. This is a question for Mr. Schmidtke in response to Alder Kimball about the nimbleness question, I guess is what I'll call it. You said something to the effect that the further we go into the year, the more we've spent our budget and there's less unencumbered funds available. How do we see the role of the contingent reserve fund play into all these decisions of what maybe, near the end of the year when we've spent some money on things that we would have then to go to that? Had you all discussed that possibility?
I think the contingent reserve as well as the general fund reserve, as I spoke about at our at the last finance committee meeting, are both probably going to have to be tapped during this year. We don't know the extent of that or where exactly it's going to have to be done. We're in the midst now of beginning the process of making projections based on the first quarter, and we'll have to continue to monitor that through the second and third quarters. As the mayor just said, the economic impacts of this are only just starting to be felt, and how that plays out in terms of both costs in the city budget, but primarily on the revenue side of the city budget is where we're going to have issues. So I would say that definitely the contingent reserve will probably have to be allocated to agency budgets. We're not sure exactly where that will be. And there might also need to be appropriations from the general fund balance. I will say though that what is before you does not allow any sort of appropriation from the general fund balance or the contingent reserve. So we're simply transferring between agencies and within agency appropriations. So actions related to the contingent reserve or the general fund reserve will require council action, including approval by 15 votes.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Alder?
No.
Thank you. Alder Moreland, another question?
Not another question, but if we're at the end of the period, I'd like to add to this resolution.
Are there any other questions? All right, seeing none, then Alder Moreland.
I'd like to add at the end of this resolution, be it further resolved that staff will report on any actions taken under this authority at the next Finance Committee meeting.
So there's a motion. Is there a second? Alder Furman.
I'd like to second that.
Alder Furman seconds. All right. So there's moved and seconded on the amendment. Alder Moreland. Did you wish to speak to it, Alder? Oh, sorry.
I would just like reporting. Yes, I'm sorry. I would just like to see some reporting when actions have been taken as a result of this resolution.
Thank you, Alder.
Thank you.
Alder Harrington McKinney.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My question is that for the next reporting to the Finance Committee, does that mean that any action taken, we would have to ask for it at the next Finance Committee, or could we build it in where it's on the agenda? So that's my query.
Alder, I think that staff would just build the report in to the agenda if there was anything to report.
Okay, and so that the amendment to the resolution would take care of it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alder. All right, is there any other questions or discussion on the amendment? All right, seeing none, is there any objection to recording unanimous consent in favor of the amendment? Seeing no objection, we'll record a unanimous vote in favor of the amendment. And so we are now back to the original resolution as amended by Alder Moreland. Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor. I move amendment to the first be it resolved clause of the resolution. It would be to strike the phrase for the remainder of the calendar year at the end of the be it resolved clause, and instead insert the phrase until June 2nd, 2020.
All right, it's been moved. Is there a second for that amendment? Alder Harrington McKinney.
Second.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Verveer?
Thank you, Mayor. This amendment obviously is consistent with the question I just posed to you, and I appreciate you being supportive of the amendment. I'm just to be repetitive here for a moment. This date obviously is consistent with the Common Council's action of last week in terms of when the emergency authority would expire no later than June 2nd, at least as of today. Obviously, both our action last week and this action, if the amendments adopted and further adopted by the council at our next meeting, could obviously be continued if necessary, and under no illusion that it might not need to be extended beyond June 2nd. But I appreciate Alderperson Kemball's concerns, and her questions, I think, were well placed, and I hope that this amendment would address some of the concerns that this is a blanket kind of order through the balance of the calendar year, when hopefully we can get back to somewhat more routine order of things, later in the year here.
Thank you, Alder. No one is more eager than I am. Are there other questions or discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, then on Alder Verveer's amendment to change the date, is there any objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor of the amendment? Alder Furman objects?
That's correct, Mayor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we will have a roll call. Alder Moreland, did you wish to speak, or were you objecting?
I was objecting.
All right, thank you, Alder. So we will move to a roll call vote. All those in favor of the amendment, aye. Those opposed, no. As your name is called, I will unmute you all, and staff will call the roll.
Alder Vidar?
No.
Alder Vidar, no. Alder Furman?
No.
Alder Furman, no. Alder Kimball?
Aye.
Alder Kimball, aye. Alder Harrington McKinney?
Aye.
Alder Harrington McKinney, aye. Alder Moreland?
No.
Alder Moreland, no. Alder Verveer?
Aye.
Alder Verveer, aye. Mayor, there are 3 ayes and 3 noes.
Thank you. The chair declines to vote. So that brings us back to the underlying motion. Is there additional question or discussion? Seeing none. Sorry, I have to, still learning the procedures here, folks. Seeing none, Alder Harrington McKinney.
Just for comment, and it goes back to the nimbleness, and 2 things. One is that the consistency of the action of the council was until June the 2nd. We by no means think that this is going to peak by June the 2nd. That's very clear. But does that give us the flexibility of moving the June 2nd date forward?
So Alder,
I know that that's not before us, but the June 2nd date was the date that the council voted on. But
Alder, if you're asking about the underlying emergency proclamation, yes, the council can take additional action on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Alder. Alder Kemball.
Thanks to my colleagues for the amendments. And had Alder Verveer's amendment passed, I would have voted for this. But I think this item is something, as Dave Schmidtke mentioned, these typically not only require council approvals, these kind of budget amendments, but a supermajority of council. So there's a really high threshold for making decisions around these budget transfers for a reason. And I'm concerned that, and while the reporting is there, thank you, Alder Moreland, for getting that in. I was also very concerned about that. That the council is really going to not only, we hopefully won't lose track of what's going on in our budget because there will be reporting on this now, but you know, losing some of our decision-making power over these very important items. Now CCEC will be meeting on Thursday to discuss how we as a body are collectively going to move forward in this crisis, how we as a body can be more nimble, can act more rapidly. And I think we have in the past, especially Finance Committee has had, you know, every year that we have emergency meetings and can act quickly on items. And I think we can find a way to act quickly on intra-agency budget transfers that are essentially budget amendments. And I just, you know, wish that we would still be part of that decision-making process. And I know that we can find a way to do that. So that's the reason for my no vote today.
Thank you, Alder. I assume that's also a request for a roll call.
Yep.
Thank you, Alder. Is there any other discussion of this item? All right, seeing none, a roll call has been requested. So it has been moved and seconded to adopt the amended resolution. All those in favor, aye, and those opposed, no. As your name is called, I will unmute you all and staff will call the roll.
Alder Vidar.
Aye.
Aye. Alder Vidar is aye. Alder Furman.
Aye.
Alder Furman is aye. Alder Kimball.
No.
Alder Kimball is no. Alder Harrington McKinney.
Aye.
Alder Harrington McKinney is aye. Alder Moreland.
Aye.
Alder Moreland is aye. Alder Verveer.
Aye.
Alder Verveer is aye. Mayor, 5 ayes, 1 no.
Thank you, Laura. That item passes, and that brings us to item number 5. Alder Vidar, motion.
Move adoption.
Alder Harrington McKinney.
Second.
Thank you, Alders. Alder Campbell.
Yeah, I just had a question, I guess, of Dave Schmidtke, maybe Mike May, but of the, if you could explain to us the underlying statutory limit to our authority over room taxes as compared to the statutory limits over our decision-making power over property taxes. And basically, why can we do this for the room tax when we can't make similar adjustments for property tax payments?
I can answer that if you like, Mayor.
Go ahead.
So the room tax is authorized under state law that local communities can implement a room tax, and they implement it with through ordinance. And it is in Madison general ordinances that we have in it the interest and penalty requirements associated with late payment of room taxes. Room taxes are paid quarterly. They're collected on the gross receipts of those transient room operators that are in effect issued a permit by the city. And so that whole late payment interest and penalty process is established through city ordinance. The property tax installment process is established under state law. And it does authorize taxing jurisdictions through ordinance to establish installment dates, but those installment dates have to be set in the August, no later than the August prior to the year in which the taxes are collected. It also is very clear that the interest and penalties are established through statute, through state law, not through local ordinance. So the distinction between the two is the room taxes, we establish the penalties through local ordinance. whereas the interest and penalties on late property tax installment payments are established through state law.
Does that answer your question, Alder?
Yeah, that does. And maybe, I don't know if this is too far off topic, but if there's anyone in this meeting who can speak to legislative efforts to amend some of those things surrounding property tax deadlines and fines, etc.
Attorney may be able to.
I know a little bit about pending legislation. I don't know whether the legislature is going to act on those things. I'd point out there's another difference. I don't know that Dave touched on it. On property taxes, the court had said, or the state law says, if you're going to amend the time when any tax payment is due, you have to have done it by August of the prior year. So unless that is changed, we have no authority to change the date that property taxes are due or the penalties or anything like that. The room tax has no such limitation. We set the dates, we can change the dates, and we can do that anytime.
I can add on the legislative action front. The governor has included in his second package of changes in response to this public health emergency a waiver of interest and penalties on a number of payments, including property taxes. The legislature, as I understand it, is also working on an omnibus bill in response to the public health emergency for some as yet scheduled extraordinary session that also includes some sort of waiver and interest and penalties. Whether or not it includes the authority to change installment dates, I think is yet to be seen. That's still a possibility. So there is, I think, a recognition by both the governor and the legislature of this issue.
Are there further questions, Alder?
Nope, thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Are there any other questions of staff? Alder Moreland.
This particular item speaks to Q1. What effect will this have on Q2 and beyond? Because I would assume that the July date would have affected Q2, or would have been the due date for the Q2 payments, correct?
Right. So what's before you in terms of the ordinance amendment would waive the interest and penalty provisions on late payment only until the due date of the second quarter payment. So it gives that break until then. I think you have to keep in mind that these room taxes in effect have already been collected by the hoteliers and others on behalf of the city and are due to the city. We're effectively giving these entities a short-term loan, and so we're giving that break for that first quarter with the expectation that they would begin to pay both the first and second quarter by that due date of July 1st, at which time the interest and penalties would again come into effect.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Are there other questions on this item? Seeing none, it has been moved and seconded. Is there any objection, or excuse me, is there any discussion on this item? Seeing none, is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of this item? Seeing no objections, we will record a unanimous vote in favor of item 5. And that will bring us to item number 6. Alder Badar.
I have to excuse myself for the rest of the meeting, so I apologize.
Thank you, Alder. We'll see you later.
Thank you.
Mr. Schmidtke.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to try to share the screen right now. You have disabled it though, whoever the host is.
Can we allow Mr. Schmidtke to share his screen, please?
Yep. Can you take a look at it again? Should be able to. Are you able to?
No, it gives me a bunch of yield signs with exclamation points on them.
Okay. Cost. Let's try making new cost. Okay, can you try again?
I'm getting the same thing.
Okay. It looks like I'm not able to change the settings while we're in the meeting right now.
Mr. Schmidtke, you did send this to all of us, didn't you?
I did. How about if I just walk through it and like we did 2 weeks ago, and individuals can work through their slides on their own screen.
Let's start that way. I'll see if I can find it and share my screen.
Okay. All right. So we'll start with the just the title slide. So this is updates to the economic impacts and some description of legislative action that have occurred over the last 2 weeks since we last touched on this item.
Have I
There we go.
successfully done it?
You have. So I guess you'll have to move the screens, Mayor.
Yes,
Thank
I'd be
you.
happy to do that.
Thank you. So we'll go to the next screen then. You saw this the first time. Just a reminder of the city is well positioned. Now, that just means that we're in good shape for the economic distress that is about to wash over us, but we do have relatively strong general fund reserves. I talked about the contingent reserve and how we'll have to use that. And we're in relatively good shape with debt and as well as any sort of pension costs, and we have strong infrastructure. So we can go to the next slide, Mayor. We'll go to the next slide. So the economic forecast, and you may have already read this in news accounts over the last couple of weeks, but the damage we talked about to the economy 2 weeks ago is going to be much worse than we anticipated. What will be a return to normal by perhaps the end of the second quarter will probably be maybe by the beginning of the third quarter, and with growth perhaps occurring within the fourth quarter of this year. A lot of that will be determined by how long the safer at home orders remain in place. To some extent, the lack of a nationwide approach on this probably could further the economic damage. And we will probably see oscillations of economic activity as there might be localized outbreaks as the generalized orders in states are rolled back or unwound. So we're closer to home, particularly with the room tax and Monona Terrace. I think until such time as individuals are willing to travel and to be in groups together again, which may not be until a vaccine is available, there probably will not be large scale meetings, which means we'll have considerably depressed hotel occupancy and many event cancellations at Monona Terrace and probably delays in new hotel construction. On the municipal debt side of the equation, interest rates have stabilized, and that's because the Fed has moved very strongly into that market to stabilize interest rates. The bond volume, so sort of bonds offered for sale during March 2020 was at its lowest level in 25 years. And individual investors who make up 70% of the municipal bond market are exiting that market rather dramatically, just given what they see as risks to state and local government budgets. We're also seeing competitive deals having very few bidders. Now that may change when the Fed moves, starting today, with the authority that they were granted in the CARES Act, they will probably begin purchasing municipal debt from banks, high quality municipal debt, starting today. The implications for us in Madison are not immediate. However, we do sell our debt in the fall, and that is a critical cash flow sale for us. We are incurring capital expenses on projects, and we carry those costs, and then we gather the revenue to actually pay those costs with the sale of our debt, which is roughly $100 million in the fall. So hopefully markets will return to some level of normality by then. And then finally, unemployment claims have skyrocketed. Again, that's been in the news as well. They're 10 times the former highest peak, which occurred in 1982. And we'll run through a few slides that that look at that impact. Before I describe this slide, the hang on one second. The one other thing that's occurred with this information is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, came out with some estimates just last week, where they predicted that gross domestic product would decline as much as 7% in this quarter, which when you analyze that, that's a 28% reduction in gross domestic product. Those are incredible numbers, and those declines could actually be larger than that, depending on what happens. The unemployment rate, as you see in the graph on this page, is probably right now at 12 to 13%. And that's based on unemployment claims filed over the last couple of weeks, which again have been unprecedented. The CBO expects that the unemployment rate will go to that 12% and will still be as high as 9% by the end of 2021. So they expect unemployment to remain high through at least the next over a year and a half. Now they base that on social distancing continuing in its current state for the next 3 months, and then that there will be later outbreaks of the virus, and that social distancing will decline by only 75% by the end of 2020, meaning there will still be some significant social distancing requirements in place. Mayor, if you could go to the next slide, please. Again, here's what shows you that dramatic jump in unemployment claims for the week that just ended. And so over 6 million in claims. You can see that back to the mid 70s, that number never broke above a million claims in 1 week. So even in the Great Recession of 2009, where you can see the little, what is now just a little blip, or the deep recessions of the 1980s, early 1980s. So this is unprecedented waters that we're in right now. Next slide, please. Again, the job losses were dramatic in March. Again, in contrast to the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and with most recessions, we tend to sort of move into it at some sort of pace. So this pace is unprecedented, and the economic impact will be felt for quite some time. Next slide, please. We're starting to see the impacts in both manufacturing and services. You'll see that drop on the slide on the left, US manufacturing. That is the most rapid pace of drop since 2009 with the Great Recession. And future indices will probably show continued drop. The services sector has dropped even faster. This index has only been in place since 2009, and you can see that we're at historic rates of fall off in services. Again, not surprising with most activity basically stopped through these safer at home orders in most of the country. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of the impact on one of the major revenue streams for both the state and for the county is that nearly 60% of sales taxes are in these two areas of retail trade and accommodation and food services. that are heavily impacted by the changes in economic activity brought about by the response to the public health emergency. So this will impact the state budget pretty dramatically, and the county budget will be affected as well. Next slide, please. Again, based on this new information, and we'll continue to look at this, the room tax forecast, which we predicted 2 weeks ago would drop about 30%, we're now predicting a 50% drop, and more information over the next weeks and months may result in an even greater drop. And so those are the types of issues we'll have to work through over the next weeks and months in terms of how to address that, the impact on programs, as well as impact on the general fund balance. Next slide, please. Again, just a reminder of where our general fund balance is at right now and where we thought it might go 2 weeks ago. We still are at probably this level, but it could drop further depending on, again, the impacts of the economic dislocation that we're seeing and how that plays out on trying to maintain programs in the city that are funded from the room tax and other sources of revenues that are particularly sensitive to these changes in the economy. Next slide, please. And then just a highlight of state and federal action. This graph just gives you a really quick picture of the CARES Act, $2 trillion, an unprecedented amount of economic support to basically maintain individuals. So $500 billion there, maintain large corporations such as the airline industry, another $500 million, small businesses through forgivable loans, again, to maintain people on payroll so that they can continue to access benefits, a little under $400 billion. And then state and local governments, some of that is Medicaid support, as well as support through specific programs, including a coronavirus relief fund funded at $150 billion and about $30 billion for higher ed and K-12 districts to support that, public health costs, and safety net support. Next slide, please. So then this just shows some of the specific programs that funding is provided for in the CARES Act. These are shown at the national level. You can see that coronavirus relief fund, the FEMA money, education stabilization. There's funding in there for federal transit aid and CDBG and so on. There are some estimates for how that might play out in Wisconsin. Dane County will get a share of that coronavirus relief fund, maybe upwards of as much as $95 million. That must be used on public health emergency response costs. It cannot be used to stabilize lost revenue, for example, the sales taxes that Dane County might lose because of this. And so that is probably a follow-on issue that Congress will have to hopefully respond to. In terms of what we know about what will happen directly to Madison, the federal transit aid we estimate will be about $25 million for Metro. Again, those have to be spent on costs related to the public health emergency. The same with the CDBG funds and the burn grants, which you see at the bottom there. We have formed an internal staff team to look at these issues and to propose citywide approaches on them. Kwesi from the Council Chief of Staff is a member of that group, and we'll be talking through strategies on how to best coordinate these dollars. Next slide, please, Mayor. And then finally, just some quick run through of what's happened with the state. I think I covered the first 3 items 2 weeks ago. The governor's offered 2 packages that total over $1 billion of state funds aimed at things like unemployment insurance, the public health response, some support to local governments, funding for state agency costs for their response efforts, and some of those changes that I mentioned around relief to individuals with waivers for late payments on property tax installments and things like that. And as I said, earlier in the meeting, the legislature appears to be developing some sort of omnibus bill for an extraordinary session that would try to touch on these specific issues. So that's a quick run through of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can go back to facilitating. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. Alder Harrington McKinney. Oh, sorry, Alder, go ahead.
Okay, the second page where you said the city is well positioned to respond to the COVID-19 event, and all the subsequent slides that you shared shows that that forecasting is tenuous, and the recovery from the crisis still is unknown. And so having what you shared in the subsequent slides and going back to the city is well positioned to respond to the COVID-19 event, would you say more about that?
Certainly, Alder Harrington McKinney. My point with that is we have relatively strong reserves, and we have debt capacity to respond, assuming that markets are out there to sell our debt. And we have a relatively strong infrastructure. So that's not to say we'll come through this unscathed, but we're in a position, as opposed to many places around the country that may not have significant or sufficient reserves to fund or to offset the drop in revenues associated with this economic dislocation. We also are not reliant on sales taxes, for example. So our property taxes are relatively stable in an event like this. And so, and we also don't have large scale pension costs that we have to fund as many state and local governments around the country also have to address. So when you kind of take those all together, we're in a better position than many other governments around the country to address what I described in terms of what's going to be happening with the national, the state, and the local economy. And that's not to say we're going to have challenges we'll have to get through, but those challenges are not as dramatic as they will be in some parts of the country. And just to give you one example, I discussed, or I commented on the access to debt markets. That's not an issue for us until the fall. There are many school districts around the country, local governments that have to be able to go out and borrow short term to just pay their everyday bills. And they were having trouble doing that over the last couple of weeks, and the Fed stepped in and allowed those markets to continue to function. We have sufficient cash balances to pay our bills right now and to pay our staff. And so we're in a good position relative to other parts of the country because of those steps that we've taken, the mayor's taken, the council's taken, in making sure that we have those strong financial foundations.
Okay,
and Alder, let me just note that there are cities around the country that are either laying off or furloughing workers at this point in time, which I assume is because they're in a weaker financial position than we are.
Okay, thank you. And my final question, Dave, and I know in other budget sessions you talked about the contingency reserve, and when we got dangerously close to that, what I'm hearing you say is that there are sufficient dollars that we are, I don't want to use the word insulated, but that's not a concern right now with the stability of our financial status.
Yeah, I think what I've described in the past is, we have certain limits under the state's expenditure restraint program, where if we spend more than those limits, we lose $7 million of state aid. Under the current emergency that's been just issued by the governor, we can spend dollars on this public health response and not violate that threshold. So that's not an issue. I think we will have to spend the contingent reserve just based on where we see cost trends going in this year's budget. That may change. And we may also have to tap into our general fund reserve overall, make appropriations from it, depending on decisions made in response to things like that 50% reduction in room taxes, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Are there other questions? Alder Revere.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Dave, for this very helpful report. I had a couple of questions that perhaps are items that aren't specifically mentioned in this written presentation, but I was hoping you could respond to. The first one is, could you please remind us that beyond the Federal CARES Act appropriation that we expect, what funds are available to us under the Federal Emergency Declaration through FEMA, through public assistance through FEMA? I know you, in your last report to the Finance Committee, said that various city agencies have been tracking our expenses related to this crisis for several weeks now. So could you remind us that there is available FEMA reimbursable public assistance outside of the CARES Act specifics?
Yes, and you'll notice that on that list of programs in the CARES Act, there was about, I think, $45 billion for FEMA itself. Yes, we are tracking all of the costs associated with the responding to the public health emergency, and we will then submit reimbursement through the county and then the state to the federal government, to FEMA, to be reimbursed for those costs. Now, the timing of that reimbursement is uncertain, and the extent to which all of those costs are reimbursed is also uncertain. But we are we're making sure that we are keeping track of all those costs and doing everything we can to seek reimbursement for them.
And given this, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Alder, I just wanted to let you know that just today I talked with Senator Baldwin herself about that, and hoping for a expanded version of what eligible costs would be under that FEMA reimbursement.
Because there's a concern that the current eligible expenses is somewhat restrictive. Is that what you're?
In the past, my understanding is that it's only been overtime that is eligible, but we obviously have significant amounts of regular work time that are being devoted to the emergency.
I understand. Thank you for that. That's a segue to my next question. If you're able to update us on the number, that would be great. But when you last reported, Dave, to the Finance Committee last month, you said that the city costs to date were approximately $125,000, excluding staff costs, to the mayor's recent point here. But do you have an estimate for us this evening as to where you think city costs to date are responding to the crisis?
Sure. We've spent about $1.2 million so far, with probably about $700,000 of that related to personnel costs. Most of that's going to be straight time, which kind of references back to what the mayor just said. Some of it's overtime, but not a lot. And then the rest is going to be supplies costs of buying personal protective equipment. There are some services contracts in there, including facilities for first responders to convalesce and things like that. So that's where we're at as of roughly today.
Thank you. Does that also include the extraordinary costs to administering the election that's apparently back on, unfortunately, for tomorrow?
I think some of the election costs are in there, but not, probably none of them are, so.
Well, so probably none of them are. So for example, the excellent work that engineering division and others have done creating those plastic plexiglass barriers, that wouldn't be in that estimate yet.
Laura, do you want to expand on that?
Alder Revere, those supply costs, I believe, are being captured there. the staff time spent on managing absentee ballots and then working the polls tomorrow and all of the staffing around the election are not.
I understand. Thank you. And then lastly, is there any update since we discussed this last month about any administrative actions that we're taking to deal with the financial impact of the crisis? Any update from last month's meeting, for example, when you talked about new hiring and non-essential purchases and that sort of thing being very closely reviewed?
No updates on that. We'll probably look to discussing options with the mayor on that when we complete the first quarter projections. So probably the end of this month, we might at least begin to contemplate those.
Thank you. One question that I could have asked last month when we were talking about kind of quasi hiring freeze, but neglect or forgot to ask is what impact, if any, this administrative actions review has on reclasses of our employees. I know when we went through this last year, reclasses were really strictly monitored and almost came to a halt, if not did come to a halt. Is that the case now? Obviously, there were no resolutions on our agenda today relating to reclasses, although there were at our last meeting.
Well, we've not seen very many. Folks are working on other things, I think.
I can appreciate that.
And I think we would take the same approach to reviewing carefully because there is, in most cases, a fiscal implication for a reclass. In general, we've been trying to, and I think I've mentioned this in the past, pre-virus, we were looking at an equity analysis of the reclass process and seeing if we couldn't improve the way that we do this. So the things had been moving a little bit slower than perhaps in previous years. I think at this point, we're still reviewing them, with a fairly high level of scrutiny for both that reason and for the fiscal reasons.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Dave and Laura.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Martin has a question.
Hi, I was wondering, I had seen that there is potentially going to be problems with disbursement of CARES funds because of the lame duck laws that were passed at the state level after the last election. If that causes a holdup into the disbursement of CARES funds, do we have, will that impact us in any way?
I think that's really hard to say. Some of those dollars, as I discussed on one of the slides, will flow directly to the city, so they won't pass through the state at all and be subject to the any sort of reporting requirements that may or may not be applied because of the lame duck laws. But some will flow to the state and that the city might be able to access, or others within the city might be able to access, and how that plays out in terms of the timing, I think is yet to be seen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Moreland.
My question was answered with Alder Verveer. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Are there any other questions for Mr. Schmidtke? All right, seeing none. Alder Moreland, would you like to make a motion?
Yes, I move to adjourn.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Harrington McKinney.
Second.
All right. Is there any objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor of adjournment? Seeing no objection, we will do so, and we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor.